So good to meet everybody, and let's dive in. We periodically do webinars talking about bringing in some neuroscience, of which this group has some good background, and applying it to the workplace primarily, although all of the things we talk about with decisions apply to all of our lives all the time. And I'm really hoping to have this interactive with things you know and bring, questions you have, etc. But really hoping to make all of the info we talk about very usable with your clients and with yourself. So Kenzie, let's fire this on up. And we can go to our second slide. The first thing I wanted to just ground us in, there's different estimates about the number of decisions that we all make every day. It's a lot, is the short answer. Some are big, who we're going to marry, what we're going to do for work, where we live, and some are minute. But one of the things that we'll talk about today, while different decisions have a different cognitive load, what they feel like to make, each decision adds up in terms of that cognitive load, in terms of the capacity we can bring forward. And so really, with our clients and with ourselves, bringing some intentionality to the way that we approach decisions. And when we don't do that, which all of us suffer from sometimes, it's where we will end up with a decision that we know we've made that isn't ideal. Or we see a teammate do something and we think, good God, how did we get here? So let's go to our next one. You know, when we think about brain science, my background PhD-wise was in neuropsychology. And the great thing is, since I went through school, so much has advanced in the field. And a lot of that is due to technology and being able to really understand what is going on in our heads when we're making decisions. There's something called fMRI, functional MRI, and what it essentially can do with little sensors on our head or going into machines is track what parts of the brain are getting a lot of oxygenation. And when that is happening, we can target what parts of our brains are being used for different things. One of the things we know when we look at decision research, and we all know this, is they're a variable difficulty. Another thing that we know, and it's the basis for habits, both good habits, bad habits, things we meant to start doing, things we wish we hadn't started doing, is that one of the functions of our brain is to, as quickly as possible, turn things that happen more than once into reflexive behavior. You all know this, when you started to drive, it was incredibly difficult. You couldn't have the radio on. You're trying to pay attention. Over time, you don't even remember driving to work. A little scary. But our brain uses so much energy relative to the rest of our body that a key thing that it is doing all the time is trying to look for shortcuts, trying to look for ways to conserve energy. So many of our decisions that are repetitive are not high stakes. One of the things we want to help people do is to turn those into more reflexive things that are happening routinely, not have everything be a learning to drive episode. And then we'll also talk about managing cognitive load. And by cognitive load, I mean focusing on really hard decisions, things that we need to concentrate on, really evaluate data. We can do that, and we as a species are magnificent at doing it. The issue is that we cannot do that all day long without breaks. We can't even do that all day long with breaks. One of the things we know from neuropsych is that every human, whether you're a morning person or not, has a higher level of dopamine when you get up in the morning. So if you feel like I can really get things done, I move faster through my projects, or if I have something I was putting off in my house, I can do it first thing in the morning. That's likely because your dopamine is higher. But we are not always really smart about saying, let's understand our neurochemistry, let's understand how the brain works with cognitive load and everything else, in saying, let's be intentional about when difficult meetings or difficult problems are being tackled. One of my personal pet peeves with organizations is the 8-hour, 9-hour strategic meeting. You know what happens by about 2 p.m, especially if there's not breaks and we don't encourage people to get up and move their bodies, eat something, take a little break from the solving. The quality of the decisions go down. I'll give you just another simple example from research with decisions. Something like, in America, physicians are really trying to lower the amount of antibiotics they're handing out as prescriptions because there's an overabundance. They're being given for things like viruses where they don't even work. They have tracked what time of day physicians are writing the most prescriptions for antibiotics, and it ends up being the end of the day. Why is that? To get into, let me have a long conversation describing viruses and put up with you, parent, who really wants an antibiotic or person. It's hard to do. That's a big cognitive load. And so what happens is they just don't do it as much. But that's true of all of us. That just happens to be in the realm of medicine. Let's go to our next slide. Some of you, how many people have read Thinking Fast and Slow? A lot, hopefully several. If you have not, you are in for a treat. It's a big, big volume by a wonderful scientist named Daniel Kahneman. We're going to refer to him again because he's also done some of the most iconic research around something called heuristics, which is another word for shortcuts, mental shortcuts, which have gotten demonized to a degree. Oh, it's terrible. We have confirmation bias. You wouldn't get through one day without mental shortcuts. None of us would. Organizations wouldn't run. So they're not good or bad. You're going to see a theme, and what we're talking about today is being intentional about what kind of decision we're making. And if it's fine to go onto autopilot or if we need to pause and use a process. So let's get into what these two systems are. And he's quick to say it's not as if there's really a system 1 or system 2 we can see on scanning in your brain. This is an analogy. System 1 is actually 98% of thinking. It's unconscious, it's fast, it's automatic, it's outside your control. That answer just pops in your head. And it's not good or bad. It just is a way of thinking. And the majority of the way we make decisions, because our brain is conserving energy and turning things reflexive as fast as possible. So if I say to you, what's 2 + 2? I'm guessing most people who've been through primary education have 4 jump into your head. That's a super simple example. But here's another example that shouldn't be a 2 + 2. What kind of person, when we kind of think of the right image of the right person, that we'd consider for the COO role in our company? For a lot of people, very quickly, what pops in our head is what we're familiar with, what we've seen as examples, which in America might be white males who are in their middle ages. That just pops in our head. That seems normal. So I think of Tom or I think of Bill. They've been with the company. They kind of look the part. That's a system 1 response to a decision that really needs some deeper process and needs a process that helps us override what our brain will immediately supply. That's a really simple example. So let's go to our next one of system 2, and then I want to pause and just hear your thoughts on this. System 2, the funny part about system 2, which is intentional and slow, if I ask you to add 438 and 671, you can do it, but it's going to take you some thinking. You probably could even do it mentally if you were forced to without paper. But again, it's going to have to be intentional and slow. If I ask a complex problem, which, spoiler alert, are many of the decisions and problems we're making in an organization, why are our margins down? You may have a system 1 answer that jumps in. Oh, the salespeople are really ripping us off by discounting. but it's probably really a system two answer. What's happened because of COVID leading to supply chain? How are the customers changing their buying behavior? Are we having discounting? And if we apply that automatic answer, it feels good. It even feels right. You might even have everybody agree with you, but it's probably not. System two is intentional. It's slow. Literally, it's harder to do. It takes more time. It's a controlled process that we need to be kind of top down to say, what do I need to consider here? Who needs to be in this decision? It is best for difficult or complex decisions, and it takes effort. That is why we don't do it all the time. Now, if I hooked up a bunch of executives to a lie detector and said, now that you understand one and two, how often are you making decisions in system two? The majority would say the majority of the time, and they'd be wrong. They're not. And that's one of the kind of insidious and delightful things about system one. It just feels right. Just feels right. That's how we maintain. Why do we still have issues with racism? Why do we still have issues with environmental things? You name it. A lot of it is because it just feels right and natural and happens without us even thinking. So let me pause for a minute. And I'm curious where anybody in the group has seen bad examples of system one or two.
I have a question. So Sarah, is there a correlation between the amount of perceived stress that a person is under, how they toggle back and forth from each one of these, as well as like I think like with stress, those intuitive gut responses as well? And you would probably say that's going to be in system one.
It is going to be in system one. That's such a good question. So, several things popped in my mind. Under stress, first of all, one of the things we know, especially if people are under intense stress, is that the amygdala, the part of our brain that is constant, it's like a smoke alarm, always looking for threats and everything else, is much more active. And there's not an inverse, but a very, almost like an inverse relationship. The more we are in amygdala activation, the more we're fired up, perceiving we're stressed or other people do. It's almost as if our prefrontal cortex, which is the thinking, planning, executive function, the master of system two, goes offline. And this is why any of us, I think, can relate to when we're very upset, agitated, stressed. If we have a time we snap at people or do something that's not us, it's probably in those moments we're not thinking clearly. We're just not thinking clearly. So yes, system one is very much amplified our odds of doing it when we're stressed.
Okay, and it doesn't matter what type of stress, it's just the environment of stress that's triggering.
Really, that's really insightful too, that I think in kind of common parlance, we think of there's good stress and, I'm having a baby, that's happy. Well, any of us who've had a baby know, yep, it is happy and it's immensely stressful. And the odds that we're operating much more out of that impulsive kind of system one are very high unless we very intentionally slow it down.
Okay. Thank you.
You got it. So, Kenz, let's go to our next slide. I can't say this enough. As you work with people, their self-report and my self-report and your self-report on whether we are making lots of reflective decisions all the time is inaccurate. And one of the other kind of crazy things about being under a lot of stress is that our self-awareness goes down. And this is why anyone around us, spouses, colleagues, friends, children, are very good at noticing when we're kind of in our backup style, when we're not at our best, being a bit more impulsive. And it's hard for us to gauge it while we're in it. We can get better at it by practicing interoception, really learning to tune into kind of those leading indicators. I feel my heart race, this kind of situation. We can get better at it. But when we're full bore in it, we're not very good at seeing it. And one of the other kind of tricky things with system one, just those reflexive decisions, is that an aspect of system one, an example of it, of a heuristic or a mental shortcut, is something called confirmation bias. And we've all heard of this. It means that when I already believe something, I tend not only to weed in things that support me, but when we do research on people, even eye movement, scanning the internet, what are they reading? They don't even notice things that don't confirm it. So it's so hard to kind of self-monitor. And this is where both processes set up for important decisions, succession, selection, I mean, I'm using organizational examples, are so important. And other people are very important because, again, they will see things in me that I have trouble seeing in myself in those moments. That's why coaches and consultants during change, which by their nature are stressful, ambiguity stresses people because your brain wants to predict. Consultants who are not going through it with a person can offer that perspective that's so important. We're not in that hot state. So let's go to our next one. So I alluded to heuristic, which is another term for mental shortcuts, and it is the currency of system one. Again, you would not get through a day or a week without a whole lot of automated ways you make decisions. Here's a really, really simple one from neuropsychology. Familiar things are safe, unfamiliar things aren't. Well, a lot of you are leading change and helping consult to that. Guess what? I mean, change by its nature is unfamiliar. I had a CEO say to me last week, it's like everybody's lost their mind. They were such rational people before. But that is what happens with a lot of ambiguity. I've been talking lately for years. I worked on change management. I'm now calling it uncertainty management because there's too many changes. There's not one change we're managing. And our brains on uncertainty just are not at their best. So that's a very simple heuristic. Familiar, good. This is one of the underpinnings of an instinctive, unconscious bias towards people in different groups. Because if you think about human evolution back for hundreds of thousands of years, probably much longer, people lived in bands up to about 150 people. There's a lot of research. It's called the Dunbar number. And if you ran into another group, and certainly if they look different than you, at the simplest level, difference is bad, familiar is good. That was a pretty safe kind of rule to live by. Now that we live in this very multifaceted, diverse community, most of us where we live, that's a really unfortunate and very problematic and dangerous reflex. So we are still running around with this software that was developed millions of years ago, but in a world that's totally different. And we need to be aware of those right feeling reflexes that aren't always helpful. So let's go to our next slide. And this is just as simple. I was very curious what Wikipedia would say. Any approach to problem solving, learning, discovery that gives a practical method. It's not guaranteed, but more often than not, it's probably right. That's why it has come into creation. It will help us get to a goal, and it'll often be useful. Let's go to our next one, because we're going to actually talk about, okay, so heuristics are good in many cases. Reflexive behavior, I have the same morning routine that works. I exercise at the same time, that's productive. I interact with people in similar ways, make fast decisions. That's critical as an executive. So what could go wrong? Let's talk about that. And you can go to the next one, Ken's. One thing is that they are often biased. So let's bring it back to the organization. when we sit down, whether on Zoom or in person with people, and we're vetting people for jobs or people are vetting us as consultants, 10 minutes might be generous. Some researchers think it's 1 minute. I mean, just a blink decision. Is this the right person, wrong person? And if you ask people, they'll give you a reason. They'll give you a narrative, but it's often happened before they even have a narrative. And I'll give you a way that you can see this. So one of the pieces of data that's been done on this, and it's really interesting studies, trying to say kind of, does the body have a reaction and a knowing before our brain can describe what it is? Were a set of studies where they set people up in front of the computer and they have on the screen 3 different decks of cards, and it would turn the cards over. Your job as the person in the experiment is to figure out which deck is good and which deck is bad. Good means that if certain colors or numbers turn over, you win some points and you're going to end up getting some money. Bad is if certain colors or numbers turn over, you're going to lose some money. And what happens is they turn them over, and my job as the person in the experiment is to say, I figured out A is good and B is bad. What happens, though, is that they also have folks hooked up to a galvanic skin response technology. And what that is measuring little bits of sweat on your palms in reaction to things. When they get about 11 cards in to this study, when card deck A starts flipping over cards, people start sweating. Their body's having a reaction. And they'll say, have you figured out which deck is good and bad? No. 10 more cards, they're sweating more. Nope, still don't know it. They get up to about 50 cards and they figure it out. Deck A is wrong. Their body has figured this out a long time ago. And this is the whole unconscious processing that's going on. The body's having a reaction to it. It takes a lot longer until we can describe what that is. A similar thing is happening, whether positive or negative, often with other people. There can be all sorts of little biases that give us clues. One of them is the liking bias, and herein is where there's a lot of unconscious bias, fill in the blank on the group that's underrepresented. Liking bias. The person kind of reminds me of me. I just feel comfortable with them. We went to the same college. They look like me. We all have kids. We all were, D1 athletes. You fill in the blank. Other ones are kind of crazy and silly. The person's wearing glasses, and at the end of those interviews, people rate them as smarter. There are all kinds of little inputs coming in that we might not even be able to identify or articulate, but they are influencing us. So let's talk about either of these. What would you do with something like this? And just sticking with the example of choosing an applicant or deciding something, we've got to have a process that is created ahead of having a human in front of us. How are we going to rate experience? How are we going to rate how smart they are? What kind of questions go to that? And then also having multiple people doing the assessing, having more than one person meeting them. Let's go to our next slide. So system 2, we talked about. System 2 filters that same candidate information to confirm system 1. So what do we mean by this? I said to you, someone might just say, they just feel right culturally. And if someone's put on the spot to say, well, why do they feel right culturally? The tricky part is unconsciously, we will come up with lots of reasons that support that. And it's insidious because our brain is great at gathering data to confirm what we think. We can come up with all kinds of things. Let's go to our next slide. And I thought we could talk a little bit about examples, and I'll pause after the first one because I'd love to see if you see this. You can go to the next one, Ken's. Functional fixedness. So functional fixedness is a really interesting thing that happens, and it's a little counterintuitive. It happens, and it's more of a problem for those of us experienced in a field. It inhibits creativity. We will take something, let's say there's an object we've always used in a particular way, or a person that's only done a particular job we've seen, and it's very hard for us to conceptualize a different way that product could be used or that person could operate. We get stuck on how we've seen it. There's kind of one way to do it. One of our colleagues told a very funny story. She has a Peloton, and one day she was stressed. She was trying to do a quick workout and then go to a meeting, and her shoes got stuck in the Peloton. And she called another colleague and said, "Oh my God, I'm going to have to do my call right here on the Peloton. I can't get my shoes out of the Peloton." And then it struck her, well, I could take my feet out of my shoes. But literally got so stressed and fixated on how do I get the shoes out? And that is what happens to us. We have one way that we see things can be, and we get very stuck with it. And I'm curious if anyone on the call has seen other people stuck with this, with how a company does things. It's very pertinent to change. Any examples?
I don't know. This might be an example. I was out with a work team. We were celebrating a birthday for lunch in a corporate environment, and the waiter coming around the table spilled a full tray of water right down my back.
Oh, no.
And glasses of water, glasses of ice water right down the back of my chair. And I just froze and looked around, and my boss leaned over and said, "Get up." There I was sitting in a chair full of water, but I didn't know what to, it was just so shocking. And it's like, oh, what am I going to do? Get up.
Get up, get moving. That is really funny. I like that example.
I can share. I am consulting on a project. Our healthcare system is recruiting internationally educated RNs, and we've got different markets. And so just trying to help markets troubleshoot their processes to roll out the red carpet and welcome their new hires. And our company is fresh on a merger. One of our markets is not quite on board with the new way of doing things. And so we're coming up with, it's a very simple idea. One of the things that the benefit package for these nurses is a sign-on bonus gift card of $1,500 when they arrive. And this market is just like, well, how do we get gift cards? And I'm like, well, I mean, you can go to Costco and buy them. No, we can't do that. Okay, well, we can add it to their paycheck. No, we can't do that. And it's almost like they're so paralyzed by their dissatisfaction of what's happened in the merger that they can't come to a decision on this simple project of just buying a gift card. So
that is super. I think that is a great example. The other thing that can come into play is when we're under a lot of stress, our ability to take risks also goes down. And I know you might say, like, going to Costco and getting a car, that's not really terrifying. But it's really interesting. We get very conservative in terms of risk taking and don't want to do anything. From a brain standpoint, if we're feeling a lot of stress, the safer path is no action, status quo. It's a bigger cognitive lift to do something. And it's really interesting if you apply this to something like data on sales. So let's take what you just said, and we want someone to stick with a contract that we have and not switch to someone else. It's better to talk to them at the end of the day, because the odds they'll do status quo are higher. If we want them to shift over to us, it's unknown, it's switching costs. First thing in the day is a better time to talk to them. But what you're pointing out is that's very much a psychology thing. So Kenzie, let's go to our next one to talk about a little more on functional fixedness. Things that happen as we get blind to options. It's just can't get my feet out of the shoes. I mean, we can't think of other ways we could solve a problem. During change, whether it's with people in coaching or organizations in change, part of where people get so stressed and stuck is they don't think there's any way to do this. At the level of brain, so when we do, again, fMRI, the part of the brain that imagines the future is the same part of the brain that can recall the past. Think about that for a minute. I construct the future out of what I have in here about the past. So it's really hard when I'm under stress to see anything beyond how I've done it. So while we're doing all the great planning things and communication and structure things with change, part of the job is to calm people down. And that is where the squishier parts around squishier, I think they're actually really substantive parts around connection, relationship are really important as a coach to have that strong bond to help people get over the hump. Children don't have functional fixedness. Anyone who's seen kids or had kids, you know, you give them a great toy and what they love is the box, and then they turn the box into something really inventive because they're not fixed. And sadly, for any of us who have a lot of experience in an area, it's very easy to get functionally fixed with what we know, because there's a lower cognitive load also to keep doing. When we look at research, I just happen to know a lot about healthcare because I kind of grew up, my PhD was in the med school, but research on physicians and who's prescribing what, even when drugs have been updated, like antidepressants or antipsychotics. It depends on what decade they went through med school. They continue to prescribe, and that's where some physicians are prescribing probably older meds that may have more side effects. So we all do it. This is nothing about particular kinds of people. It's something we just need to be aware of. So let's go to our next slide, Kenzie. You know, ways we can work with this, knowing that we all have it. When we are really stuck, it's really useful to abstract the problem, and analogy can be a great way to do that. Some of the biggest scientific breakthroughs have happened, first of all, by people outside of the direct science branch because they don't have functional fixedness, but also by abstracting. So when people were trying to figure out how would we make Band-Aids and different things that are water resistant, that stick when they're wet. Some of the research they did was looking at animals, sea animals that have sticky suction cups, or when they wanted to see water resistant materials, how is that done in animals that live in the water? How does their skin work? And when you abstract it out and say, what's going on? These are the elements, apply it back to the problem. Often we get breakthroughs. Crowdsourcing is really helpful because not everybody's fixed in the same way. Any of us are, including going to, you know, I'm in psychology I love talking to my son who's an engineer and saying, how would you solve this problem? Like, how would you think through it? And it's a very different process that can be useful in me than saying, how would I do that from psychology? So let's go to our next one. Priming, I'm just giving you a couple of things to think about. We could do this all day. Priming is another example of something to think about, and advertisers have known this forever. It's a bias that happens when we've been exposed to something that we're not even consciously focused on it. And then it influences our responses to other things. So it's just crazy how this works. If we have people, for instance, estimate or tell us what are the last 2 digits in your Social Security number. And then we ask them to estimate how hot it is in a city that they don't live in. Let's say I'm in Minnesota. I'm estimating how hot it is in Florida. Their estimates will be higher if they've just been primed by thinking about a higher Social Security number, if it was 99 or 95 or 88, than if it's a smaller one like 33 or 12 or 19. And as bizarre as that sounds, there's something, it's almost like that area gets activated and I respond. Let's go to the next one. This is why it can be really insidious when, for instance, if we're trying to personally or in society have people eat healthier food for society, and what they're primed with constantly is high fat, trans fat, sugar, whatever. The odds that they're going to turn around and buy it are really high. It is priming itself is agnostic. It's not something that's good or bad. It just is something that happens reflexively, but it can be tied to habit formation and we can use it in a positive way. So when we want to be doing more of something, use a simple example. I want to start walking 15 minutes every morning to get some sunshine and exercise. Simply having our shoes out in a visible spot makes it more likely. If I want to do something less, any example, I don't want to be scrolling on my phone all the time. Developing a habit that when I get home, I put the phone in a different room makes it less likely that I'll get on it. And it's kind of crazy how simplistic it is. If we want something to happen more, make it more obvious. If we want it to happen less, we need to make it less obvious. This also ties to why it really matters who we spend time with. It's not just how we feel around people. They are priming us all the time with their habits. So if I want to be more active, it's really important to be hanging around more active people. It's priming us even unconsciously. So let's go ahead. Was someone going to chime in?
I read a book 20 years ago that I still remember. It's called Mindless Eating by Brian Wassink, I think. I don't know, Sarah, if you know it, but it is full of concrete examples that all of us have experienced in life that show that. So the studies are like, it's candy dishes in offices, right? If it's an open candy dish and you just reach in how much you eat, if it's simply got a cover on it, but you can still see it and it reduces by 50%. And in the whole book is every kind of thing like that. And because it's so day to day in what we actually see, obviously 20 years later, I can still quote it. So that gave some real good tips. And I wouldn't have labeled it priming, but now I can see that you could.
It's just fascinating. I mean, what you're saying is priming and combining with conservation of energy. And you might say if the candy bowl is, I have to stand up, I'm at a conference table versus arm's length, will that make a difference? Oh, it'll make a huge difference.
Yeah. So the sequence for candy, just because I can remember it so clearly, is open dish that you can see through, open dish that you can't see through, closed dish that you can see through, closed dish that you can't see through, 1 foot away, 3 feet away, like 10 feet away in a drawer. All right. And it declines by like almost consistently, pretty much 50%. Consumption goes down like 50% every single time.
It's
amazing.
fascinating.
I lost 20 pounds reading this book without trying.
I believe it.
It was insane. It was insane.
Well, and I think as we work with people wanting to start things or stop things or help other people start or stop, we really need to pay more attention to the environment, direct environment, social environment, what's easy, what's hard. It plays a huge factor. We tend to blame people. They're not doing X, Y, and Z. And my first go-to is, what is the environment inducing? Because it just has a huge effect on us. Let's go to our next one. How we can leverage it, and truly for ourselves and our clients, it's huge. Awareness even knowing that it works for us tends to make it work better. There's kind of a circular piece with our beliefs and with awareness, making choices about inputs. So priming, it's so funny, the number of clients I had during the pandemic, of course, everybody was having some anxiety, uncertainty, a lot were having depression, and would say, I'm just so anxious. Well, what do you do when you get home? I turn the news on and see what's happening with COVID. I get that. And yes, we want to be informed at a high level. Watching 4 hours of, news about all the horrible things, that's your input. You're being primed that everything's falling apart. So one of the biggest things we can do with both mental health, and I get not everybody has equal opportunity for different things, but there are typically in almost every situation some input on what is being put in, because that primes, whether it's news, whether it's people, whether it's intentionally exposing ourselves to something that is motivating, positive, uplifting, expanding our knowledge about something we don't know, really important. And clarifying our values and getting really clear about what we want as those inputs can be really helpful also. So let's go to our next slide. And this is something, and we'll send this to you if you're interested in this. It's not that I want you to run through the 8-point checklist every day. It's meant to be a bit more a la carte on things you can think about for yourself and your clients. One thing is to even become mindful, even if you don't do anything different, of how am I making decisions and when am I faced with a bigger versus a smaller decision? And then the next step would be bringing awareness to one decision. How am I deciding this? I don't mean brushing your teeth. Hopefully that's a fixed habit and probably a good one. But if I'm making a bigger decision about something, how am I doing it? Am I being thoughtful about the time of day I'm doing it, the cognitive load, other inputs I need? Identify higher stakes decisions. We may not know all of them coming our way, but there typically are patterns to bigger ones that are happening at work, and really trying to raise our awareness not to make fast decisions on those. Research shows even waiting 30 seconds can lead to a better decision because you are not just going with that impulse that feels right. Check in with our gut feeling on big decisions and litigate the other side. The great thing and the scary thing about our brain is any question we ask ourselves, it dutifully provides lots of data. So if I ask, why is this the perfect candidate? You will get all that data. The problem is that's not all the data. So with big decisions, also asking the counterpoint, what are all the ways this person isn't right or doesn't fit with what we're trying to do as an organization? Or if I'm very fired up about something, doing the pre-mortem. Okay, I'm a year out, this fails. What has happened? Your brain will dutifully generate information, but it kind of needs to be called upon, system 2, to do that. Find a neutral person, say it to them, and see what they come up with. They are not influenced by the emotional side. Use data in decision-making when it's an important decision. I'm not saying anything that should be automated. Think about the environment in deeper choices, whether it's for ourselves or for other people. For instance, if they make a mistake, how might the environment be tightened? Because there may be a clue there on something we can do differently in the future. Actively cultivate our creativity. The best way to get more creative is have more diverse inputs. If all I read are about running or health, which are some of my favorites, my creativity, even in solving things that I'm thinking about related to health, is going to be limited. The creativity comes through that analogy and abstraction, and that requires other inputs. And then spending 10 minutes a day in meditation, prayer, reflection, reading inspirational things, whatever speaks to you, is actually a way we can build our muscle around focus. And focus is an ingredient in being able to make those deeper decisions. So it also helps stress and helps positive well-being. There's lots of good reasons to do it. But focus is something that is built by focusing. And it's something very worthy to do each day. So let me pause there and open it up for any questions, thoughts, reflections.
I have a question, Sarah. In the System 1, System 2, has there been any research that says that good leaders maybe do System 2 3% of the time or more time than System 1 thinking?
Well, it's funny, Daniel Kahneman, the creator of this, actually has commented on something similar to that. He said, oh, I fall prey to this just as much as anyone. So what he would say, and what I really believe working with people, is it's not that they become better at suddenly they're System 2 thinkers. They're better at setting up systems and ways to force themselves to do System 2 thinking. I think System 1, System 2 is part of the machinery up here. I doubt in a lifetime we're going to shift that, but they are good at saying, I will fall into traps. Also with leadership teams, oh my Lord, that's one of the main places. What is our process for doing this? Not to fall into confirmation bias or easiest thing.
One thing that came to my mind just about the heuristics in hiring and how the like me bias and whatever, I think, we hear so much in D&I about having a diverse slate of candidates. And while that's fantastic, they can't be properly evaluated without a diverse slate of evaluators. I hadn't really thought about that before, but
to balance the preference bias 100%.
And it wouldn't have to be the full process either. Like you could have people gathering data, but to have those backstops, even one step away, might be enough. It'd certainly be a step.
It would certainly be a step. I mean, because again, it's unconscious. And if you say, why did you like fill in the blank, this white person more than this person of color? There'll be all sorts of reasons we can come up with back to why is this a good idea? Why is this a bad idea? Your brain will give you data for both. And that would be part of setting up a system. The other thing, like some organizations we've worked with, will, to the best of their ability, kind of blind the data coming in and have meeting the person last. So we have all that they need to have this experience or this degree or this whatever, and you evaluate it without knowing their name or their school or their neighborhood. That can be pertinent too. And that shifts dynamics of what comes in.
So it sounds like the requirement is to understand that these two kind of ways of thinking exist, but then systems are necessary to actually fight. The awareness itself is not enough to actually work against, right? That makes sense.
I would sure say that. I mean, the awareness may be helpful in knowing these are the kinds of decisions where I need a system or a process or a pause or another human to talk to.
There's data on that though from our old D&I stuff. So it's at the NBA. It's the NBA. So they did data. They showed that Black referees call more fouls on the opposite. You call it on the opposite gender more, or the opposite race more. And the NBA said absolutely not. That's not true. No way. So they ran the study again, and of course it was true. So then they saw the data and believed it, and they ran the study again, and just the knowledge of it did reduce it. So that was an interesting one.
Because they knew, that's super interesting.
And those are the super fast, refereeing a game is that fast decision, right? Is it a foul or is it not? So
totally.
That we used to quote that one quite a bit.
I think, is that something called the Hawthorne effect, where once a group or an individual knows that they're being observed, that the behavior that you're trying to observe will stop, because
well, maybe stop or change. That's great. Okay. That is the Hawthorne effect, back from when they did studies on productivity in big plants. And they thought if we change the lighting, they'll be more productive. And they were, but then they changed it back and they were again. Just being watched and knowing it was being monitored shifted it. So totally right.
I had a comment on the counter activities to the functional fixedness that I think was actually maybe part of point number 3 on the 8-point checklist. And that is, I used to teach a class where we were trying to help coming up with solutions to problems and making those decisions. And a technique of brainstorming that was really effective was thinking about what it was that you wouldn't want to do. So you had mentioned, Sarah, for stickiness underwater, look at animals who have that capability. And then the opposite. So what are some solutions that we don't want? And I found that people really enjoyed doing that in the brainstorming activities, that it was kind of fun to think about what don't we want, which might then lead us to what do we want. So a little bit of a different twist on the analogy, or even arguing the counterpoint, but it's really literally intentionally brainstorming what wouldn't work to help identify what would.
I love that. And it also forces, again, that system to reflection. I mean, anytime we need to pause and go, wait, 436 plus 671.
Yeah.
I had a tiny example. We were on a team trip. Kenzie was there too. And we went hiking in Joshua Tree Forest. And something we work with companies a lot is on change and transition. And I think it was Kenzie reading, this forest is in transition. This is where the Mojave Desert meets the blah, blah desert. And what you'll notice in this transition zone is there's elements of both. And while I've talked a lot about how confusing transition is, or something's ending and something's starting, I've never thought about there's actually examples of both, which is part of what's confusing. Like, which culture are we in? And that was an example of kind of a real-time analogy. It wasn't on purpose, but I thought that is so interesting. That is part of why it's hard. You don't know if I'm in this desert or this desert.
It's a great example.
I like that thought. In some of the transition work I do, I bring up John Fisher's process of transition. And I, on a Zoom call, will have the team annotate where they think they are in, and it's an anonymous tool, of course. And so some people will be in hostility or, depression. And then you have some people moving on. But then we have the discussion of, we're all at different places. We're all in the same transition, but we're all in different places today on this curve. How do we help each other be okay and move forward together? So I think that's the Joshua Tree thing is it's more beautiful and eloquent than doing it that way. I think one cool thing that really sticks in my mind is abstracting, and how kids have no fixedness. I think, we've all been party or witness to the child just being more enthralled with the box than the $100 toy. And what a beautiful thing that is, and how necessary that is in time and spaces. And then my mind goes to how we almost not beat it out of people, but like, how do we implant that into people so that they are fixed, and how that hurts but helps us too, because obviously there's societal norms and cultural norms and things that we have to abide by. If we were all just super kooky playing with boxes, right? There might be some chaos in our societies, but where can we have a beautiful balance of both?
I love some of that too. A lot of times we get participants that don't want to do the fluffy stuff because they think it's taking away. But the whole point is to shift out of the fixedness. So it makes me, and Bev, your example too about what don't we want to have happen? We used to have one activity where it was make it worse. And that was all we had them do, was make it worse. They didn't know that the second part was, now for each thing on your make it worse, you have to make it radically better. So they were stuck with coming up with an opposite for whatever it was, but it was so fun to make it worse that pushed them into the roller coaster fun, way out there thinking. Yeah, that is a fun one.
That's really fun. This has been just great having you all on here. Thank you so much for joining and participating and seeing all your faces. And feel free to send any other thoughts or questions to me via email. Would love to hear them. It was what a neat group of people. Thank you so much.
Thank you.